Chapter 9. Elizabeth. Elizabeth wandered back into the bedroom and set her bag on the bed. His bed. Her husband's bed. The words felt odd and foreign in her mind even as she thought them. What had she been thinking, leaving the only life she knew to come here to this foreign place with a man she didn't know? But she hadn't had a choice. Not really. She couldn't have stayed in Chicago and remained true to herself. She sat on the bed, much harder and lumpier than the one she'd had back home, and wondered if she'd even be able to sleep here. There was nothing around. No pedestrians, no sounds from carts, no street lamps. It must get frightfully dark in the evenings, and she wondered how Carl lit the cabin when the sun set. Yes, there was a candle on the table, but it wouldn't give much light. He must have lamps somewhere. Perhaps she should go looking for them just in case. She decided to unpack her clothes first, refolding the few dresses she'd brought with her to place in the dresser in the room. As she opened the drawer, she realized his clothes were already filling some of the room. What should she do about them? Did she leave them? Take them out? And if she did, where did she put them? Leaving them seemed to be the best option, so she did, and simply put her things to the side. It wasn't like she had many anyway. Leaving as quickly as she had forced her to be choosy in what she took with her. With her dresses unpacked, she took the quilt out and added it to the bed. Even if it didn't get cold enough to use it, just being able to see it made the room feel a bit more like home. But only a bit. It would definitely need more touches to feel like hers. She scanned the small room one more time, looking for anything that might tell her more about Carl, but other than his clothes, there was nothing personal in the room. Perhaps the rest of the house would hold more clues. So, grabbing the dress she needed to wash, she wandered into the main room. It was simple, with the only furniture being the couch, a chair, and a small table, but the furniture did look sturdy and handmade. Had he made it himself? There was no sewing basket by the chair like she'd had back home, but she could do without for now, and she was relieved to see a lantern on the table. The room also had a large fireplace, but still nothing that would tell her much about the man who lived here. She wandered into the kitchen and took stock of what he had. Pots, plates, cutlery, but not a lot when it came to cooking. There was flour, corn, some canned foods, and what looked like vegetables, though they were nearing the end of their edibility from the looks of it. She'd check the garden next to see if anything could be added. However, it appeared a stew would be in order tonight. It was the only way she could think to make the vegetables palatable. There was no meat lying about, and none in the small icebox he had, so she made a mental note to look for a shed. He probably had meat in there. On the small table, she found the first personal items she'd seen. A ceramic mug, which meant he was likely a coffee drinker like her father had been, and his Bible. Well, coffee she could certainly do, and the tension in her heart eased a bit with the realization that he probably read his Bible as much as she did. Perhaps they could read together, as she and her father had done before he'd gotten sick. After she washed her dress and made dinner, of course. If she could find everything she needed. She decided to prepare the meal first, and draped her soiled dress across the back of a chair. Then, grabbing the largest pot she could find, she began chopping up the vegetables and adding them. When that chore was finished, she grabbed her dress and wandered outside to survey the rest of the area and search for a wash tub. She found a tin tub with a washboard near a water pump, so she filled the tub and washed her dress first, and then hung it on the line to dry. Then she turned her attention to the garden. The little garden was lacking, but well-maintained. She hadn't been the biggest gardener back in Chicago, but she could probably figure out how to keep what he had planted growing, and maybe she could find someone who could tell her if any crops that would grow well here were missing. A few carrots and potatoes looked ready, so she pulled them up, but with no basket to put them in, she simply cradled them in her arms. Then she surveyed the rest of the area. There were 2 small buildings a few dozen feet from the house. The smaller one was no doubt the outhouse. She shuddered at the idea of having to traipse out there every time the urge hit, but she could do it. It was better than life with Jacob. The other building was a little larger and probably held the meat. She headed that direction to see if there was any meat she could add to the stew to help with the stock. Even in the bright sunlight, she shivered when she opened the door. Not only was the shed much darker inside, but the rows of deceased animals hanging from the ceiling were a little unnerving. Thankfully, near the back, she found some meat she thought might do. She untied it as quickly as she could and hurried out of the shed. Perhaps she could ask Carl to get the meat she would require daily so that she needn't venture in the shed often. With that job done, she returned to the kitchen, cut up the meat and the few carrots and potatoes she'd brought in, and added them to the pot. After rummaging a little more, she managed to find some herbs that she hoped would help and added them. Then she glanced out the window. The sun was lower in the sky, but not setting just yet. She wondered if she should start the stew now or give it a little longer. She decided to fire it up and just keep the flame low. She could always remove it from the heat and let it sit if he took longer than she expected. With her womanly duties done, she wandered around the small house aimlessly. What in the world was she going to do to keep herself busy here? Yes, she had her sewing, but with no new fabric there would be little to sew on, and she didn't have the money to purchase much new fabric. She had her Bible, so there was plenty of reading, she supposed. But even though she loved being in God's Word, she didn't think she could fill all the time in the evening with that. Gardening and cleaning wouldn't take up her entire day, but maybe Carl would teach her what else she could do to help. Though she did not miss working in the saloon, she did miss the bustle of the city and the availability of stores. At least in Chicago, she could have walked the streets and looked in the windows to pass the time. Well, there weren't shop windows here, but there were items that needed to be purchased. If she could find some paper and a pencil, she could write them down for the next time they went into town. He had no writing desk like she'd had back home, but after a few minutes of searching, she was able to find some paper and a pencil. Sewing basket was the first thing she wrote down, along with supplies for sewing. She'd brought what she could with her, but she could use more string. Plus, she should add some yarn for knitting. There had been some still attached to her mother's needles, but it wouldn't last long. A basket for collecting food was the next item added to the list, along with some food items she would like to pick up. Of course, she would ask him tonight if he perhaps had the items somewhere she hadn't looked, but if not, they would need to be picked up. Then she wrote down fabric. She would need some new dresses, having left most of hers behind when she fled. Dresses. The mere word gave her pause. Before her father got sick, she'd spent hours sketching designs. It was a lofty goal, she knew that, but even if she could only sew for friends, like the lady she'd met on the train, it would be worth it to see the joy on their faces. Could she do that here? She allowed her mind to imagine it for a few minutes, and then shook her head. That would be silly. Not only would women here probably not be interested in her designs, but setting up something like that might draw attention to her name. And while she didn't think Jacob knew where she had gone, she couldn't be too careful. After all, Margaret had mailed the letter, so she might remember the address, and she'd told Mary she was going west. She didn't think her friend would deliberately tell Jacob where she'd gone, but she had no doubt he could break her if he knew she had the information. No, a dressmaking business would never be a realized dream now, and she would just have to get used to that. Perhaps she couldn't start a business, but that didn't have to stop her from drawing. Without even realizing she was doing it, her hand began to sketch one design and then another. It was only when she realized the image was hard to see that she glanced up and discovered the sun was setting. Oh no, he would be home soon and she hadn't checked the stew. After lighting the lantern to give her more visibility, she checked the stew, relieved to see it had not burned. In fact, it looked perfect. The only question was if Carl would return in time to eat the stew while it was still warm. She sat down at the table, unsure if she should eat without him or not. It seemed rude to do so, but then again, her stomach had been making very unladylike noises recently, and she had no idea when he would return. What if something happened to him out on the acreage? How would she even know? And if something did happen, what would she do? Carl had mentioned a Doc Moore, but she had no idea how to reach him. She didn't even know how to get back to town. With a sinking feeling, she realized she knew very little about her new life, and for the first time, it scared her. Thankfully, she didn't have to worry long as the front door opened and Carl entered.
"Sorry I'm late. One of the cows was being stubborn tonight, and my foot slowed me down."
Though she wasn't familiar with his normal look, he appeared more tired than he had earlier. His broad shoulders rounded forward slightly, and there was a haggard appearance to his face that she hadn't noticed when he left earlier. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Are you sure we shouldn't take you to see the doctor?" Carl shook his head.
"I'll check it again in the morning, but I'm sure it will be fine."
Elizabeth knew better than to continue arguing with him. Her father had been just as stubborn, but it didn't make her feel any better. "Well, I made stew for dinner, and it's ready. Did you already wash up?" Oh dear, was that even proper to ask? She always washed up before she ate, but perhaps he didn't. Could she live with a man who didn't practice proper hygiene? His lips pulled into a slight smile as he looked at her.
"I did, and stew sounds amazing. I can't tell you how nice it is to come in after a hard day of work and realize the food is made. I've been living off canned beans and whatever I could cook quickly for too long."
"Well, I hope the food is to your liking," she said, as she stood and moved to the stove to serve the stew.
"I have no doubt it will be. It smells wonderful in here."
"It did?" Elizabeth sniffed the air inconspicuously. She supposed there was a smell of vegetables permeating the air that was comforting, but she wished she'd had more spices to add. Picking up the ladle, she filled both bowls and carried them back to the table, setting one before her husband and then taking her own place.
"And it looks great, too," he said softly. "Let's give thanks because I'm famished."
Elizabeth bowed her head and listened as Carl thanked the Lord for health, home, and sustenance, and then she waited for him to take the first bite.
"Very good indeed."
He barely looked up from the bowl as he shoveled another spoonful in. "Thank you." Elizabeth smiled, glad that he seemed to be enjoying her food so much. "I hate to ask, but do you think we could return to town soon? There are some spices and food items I'd like to pick up, as well as some fabric for more dresses." His eyes lifted to hers, but before he could say anything, she hurried on. "I have a little money to cover it if necessary." He swallowed his bite of food and grinned at her.
"That won't be necessary. I saved money in anticipation of you coming. We can go in tomorrow early. I have some things I need for the farm as well."
A feeling of relief flooded Elizabeth. She had felt he was different from Jacob, but now he was proving it. "Thank you."
"Of course."
The rest of the dinner passed in silence, and though it was mildly uncomfortable, Elizabeth wasn't sure how to fill it. After dinner, he retired to the living area and sat down with his Bible.
"Will you join me?"
he asked as she began placing the bowls in a tub to wash them. She wanted to, but she didn't want to shirk her duties. "Oh, I need to take care of the dishes, but you go ahead." He placed the Bible on the table and stood, coming to her side. With a gentle hand, he touched her arm, causing her to pause in her efforts.
"The dishes can wait. I'll even fill the tub for you myself after. I would really like for you to join me."
"Very well." Elizabeth smiled as she followed him to the main room. She sat on the couch while he sat in his chair. It had been a while since she'd had someone read the Bible to her, as her father had been too ill before he passed, and after that, she'd been staying in the saloon, so there was very little Bible reading there. She hadn't really thought this would be a part of her life again. Carl cracked the Bible open and began reading. Elizabeth liked the sound of his voice. It was deep and melodious and reminded her of music she'd once heard wafting out from a dance hall. He was a good reader, giving inflection to the words and not halting or stumbling very often. When he was finished, he asked her if she had any questions. She shook her head. The reading had been fairly straightforward and easy to understand.
"Perhaps another time, then,"
Carl said, closing the book and placing it on the nearby table.
"Let me get you that water."
Effortlessly, he took the tub of dishes outside, returning a few minutes later. He placed the tub in the kitchen and returned to his chair. When his eyes closed, Elizabeth took that as her cue to finish her work in the kitchen. Before she was done, she heard the sound of even breathing, followed by an occasional snore. She wondered if she should wake him to have him move to the couch. It would surely be more comfortable. Or perhaps she should simply place a blanket over him and leave him to figure it out. Uncertain, she chose the latter option as it seemed less invasive. And with that task done, she continued to the bedroom and shut the door. She stepped out of her dress, folding it neatly to sit atop the dresser before climbing into the bed. It was a strange sensation, sleeping in someone else's bed. Not only was the mattress unfamiliar, but she couldn't help picturing Carl sleeping under these covers just the night before, and that led her mind to wander to when he might ask for his bed back. They were married, and he had every right to share the bed as her husband, but the thought still gave her trepidation. She'd had little physical interaction with men, having been too independent when she was younger, and then too busy once her father got sick, and the thought of any sort of intimate touch gave her pause. It would be a hurdle she would have to address soon, but for tonight she would push it from her mind and enjoy the feeling of relief of being away from the saloon and Jacob.